little bit earlier than normal. All right, welcome back. We are about a minute early. It is COMP229 Web Application Development at Centennial in the summer 2021 semester, and it's week 5. I was going to say week 1. Week 5, part 1 of our broadcast, and we're going to continue talking about the same stuff we were working with last week and the last several weeks. Let's get going as we have a lot to cover in a very short time. All right, so we are sitting here and we talked about a bunch of stuff last week in terms of, hey, what is MongoDB? How do we get all that stuff happening? We didn't quite get to the read operation, but I gave you that information online. And this week, what I really want to do is do Express CRUD or CRUD with MongoDB is really what I want to get to. And then we'll hit authentication in week 6. So that is what's happening. That is officially how we're supposed to do it. Just a note for next Wednesday's class. So for the people that are with me next Wednesday, typically I do kind of a synchronous broadcast, or I kind of connect with Zoom and so on. But next Wednesday there's a bit of a conflict. So I'm going to let you guys do things asynchronously. That means you'll be able to watch the video from Monday and then go along on your own for Wednesday. So that is what's happening for Wednesday's class. That's kind of an update that's going on next week. Let's go into what we did last week. So last week we started talking about MongoDB, and some of you went ahead and actually followed along, which is great. I talked about pushing everything to Heroku. You needed that part so that you could connect and submit your assignment 1. And as for assignment 1, which was due last Friday at midnight, I've marked about 25% of them already. Most of them are very, very good, the ones that I've marked. And if that is an indication of how the rest of them are going to be, I'm pretty happy with the stuff that you guys are giving me. However, there are always some students who are just not following the assignment requirements. And that means things like you're using your own generator. That wasn't permitted. So if you use something else other than the Express generator, you lost marks and pretty much didn't pass the assignment. And that was what I talked about the whole time. You need to follow what I've asked you to do. No shortcuts. That's not what this is about. This is about you learning the basics from the ground up, from scratch. Any shortcuts, you're going to lose marks for. Okay, so that's what I talked about last time, and that's what's going to happen as we go forward. And especially when we get into your project, which is in the second half of semester, it's going to just hurt you and your teammates if you don't follow requirements. So please make sure you do that going forward, especially for assignment 2, when we hit things like authentication and that kind of stuff. We do more full CRUD. That's create, read, update, and delete operations with MongoDB and MongoDB Atlas. And I'm hoping to get to that either this week or next week. Hopefully that'll help you complete assignment 2. All right, so that is what we did last week. And this week, what are we doing? I'm going to try and get as much of the CRUD operations done with MongoDB, and that's create, read, update, delete. If we have time, excuse me, I will try to get you set up with MongoDB Atlas, okay, which is a cloud service, okay? This is if we have time. I'm not sure that we will. And if we don't have time this week, then we'll hit it next week. So I want you to kind of see the workflow, which is what we're talking about. So we're sitting on week 5. Next week, assignment 2 is due. It's coming up fast and furious. And again, assignment 2 is based on assignment 1, where you add a secure area of your website. And the secure area allows you to do full CRUD operations. To support this, I've done a couple things differently up online. So one of them is week 5 and week 6 have now been exposed. So that way you can look at all the videos you need to get your assignment 2 done as fast as possible, instead of you waiting around for me to open them up. So week 5, we have a couple videos here on Express CRUD, which I'll be going over the bulk of today, if I can, with TypeScript. So these are non-TypeScript videos, like I mentioned. Some people I've noticed in their assignment 1 have submitted their assignment 1 without TypeScript. That's perfectly fine. It's acceptable. As long as you follow the requirements, I'm good. You get full marks. If you haven't followed the requirements, like I said, or you didn't use what I've asked you to do and you've used something completely different, this is where you lose marks. So, but otherwise, so there's about 2 hours to watch from Express CRUD. I'll try and go through it with you as well. And that's this week. And then I start talking about authentication with Passport this week as well, right? That's kind of what this is all about. So it talks about what Passport is, and that's what this thing is all about. And then next week, we get into more. So notice that I start getting into authentication with Passport. I will not be able to cover all of this with you next week, especially things like authentication with JWT. So again, these are all videos that you should probably watch ahead of time, so that way you can be successful with assignment 2. So make sure you get that done. Again, assignment 2 is due June 18th. That's next Friday at midnight. And you should have access, and that should be open to you to submit as soon as possible. Right? So if you've already started with assignment 1 and you finished it, please make a new repository. Please don't work off of the old repository, because I'm currently going through assignment 2 with a brand new repository based off of assignment 1. All right, and there's different ways of doing that. You can copy paste and make a brand new repository, but assignment 2 should be separate. It should not be something that is a continuation of assignment 1 from a GitHub repository perspective, which means you have to make a new repository. That's what I'm asking you to do. A couple things also I should mention in your submission of assignment 1. I got to go back to this again. Some people, for whatever reason, they're missing stuff, and I'm not going to say not following assignment requirements. I mean, they're missing stuff, like as in you didn't submit your GitHub repo, you didn't submit your live link, but you showed it in your video somehow. So I mean, I gave you part marks for that. Or you didn't have a single slide, that is required, that basically shows your face and talks about who you are and all that kind of stuff. There was things missing. Please go through the assignment and use it as a checklist. If you don't do that, you will lose marks that are easy. Some people didn't include internal documentation, which are comments, and you lost marks for that. So, I don't want you to lose marks at all. I want you to get full marks, but I can't give you marks for free. Okay, so please make sure you go through your assignment requirements and hit all the requirements. Okay, so assignment 2 is due next week, and then midterm is the following week, and it's going to be a comprehensive exploration of the concepts for both assignment 1 and assignment 2, but it won't be as long. So in other words, I won't be asking you to do all the same things as assignment 1 and assignment 2 in so much detail. You'll probably start with a starter, and then you'll go from there, and you'll have the whole week to get it done. It'll open on the probably on a Sunday or Monday, likely today, although it's up in your it'll be up in the videos for you. Okay, so let's get back to what we're doing today then. So today, even though it says, hey, we're supposed to do authentication with Passport, and that's your requirement, and it talks about that throughout the entire thing. What we're going to be talking about in the synchronous portion of our class today is, hey, how do I do full CRUD with Express? Because that is kind of a baseline for how to do things with Passport. So let's get to that right away. So to start that, what I've done, I've gone ahead this week and I've given you a week 5 starter, which is just last week's week 4D. That's what we're starting with this week. So basically, it's everything you need to get going with your week 5. We start with week 4. So I'm just going to download this code, just like you would. Click download. And when I do, it's going to pull down this. For whatever reason, my zip archive has now been associated with VLC Studio video player, which is fine. It doesn't really matter to me. I'm just going to open this up in the appropriate. I love when this happens. VLC Media Player does some really funky things sometimes. And I don't know why, but for whatever reason lately, my VLC Media Player has associated itself with zip archives. So that's weird. And I'm going to try and fix it, but for now, who cares? So here it is. It looks like VLC, but it's really not. I'll cut this out and I'll go to here and paste it. And again, doesn't matter, even if it shows you this little symbol here, you can ignore it. And you can right click and you can go 7-zip and unzip it. There we go. And then you can notice that this says week 4D main. We're going to change this to week 5. And you guys are the C team, so week 5C as normal. And that's where we're going to start off today. So week 5C, let's get this structure into our Visual Studio Code. So again, bring up Visual Studio Code here, and let's drag and drop that in there. And when we do that, then what I want to do is, again, do a couple of changes. One of them is change this from week 4D to week 5C, right? And we'll say this is week 5. And in our package.json, let's move this from 0.02 to 0.03. So like a little minor update. And again, it's demo project for week 5, not week 4. We're also going to change this to week 5C. So that is the structure we're going to use, just like we've done in the past. Save. So far, so good. Our readme.md is all up to date and everything's fine. And now we can just do a control backtick, which is going to bring up our terminal window. And just like we've done in the past, I'm going to do a git init and a git add dot. And that adds all the stuff that we had from before. And a git commit -m initial commit. This is how you could probably use assignment 1 to start assignment 2. It's download assignment 1, and then start up a new repository, which is what I'm going to do here. So again, if we go up online to here, I'm going to go to Centennial, and let's make a brand new repository here. So again, new repository, we're going to call it COMP229 in the summer 2021 semester, and it is week 5C. That's you guys, right? And make it public, because you would make it, if you were going to share with me, you can make it private and use me as a collaborator, or you can keep it public for you guys, doesn't matter. Okay, press enter. And then when we do that, you're going to have an empty repository. We've already done this piece for the most part. Now I just need the bottom part, right? So these 3 lines of code here. So I'm going to grab these 3 lines of code, go into Visual Studio Code, and just, clear this, and right click, and then press enter, and we're good to go. It'll put everything up on GitHub. And this is how we start. Remember, we always start just this way, so that way we're up to date with our project and everything else, okay? So now if I check online and if I refresh, you'll see that this is week 5C. So what happened? Well, I never saved my README file. That's okay. Let's save it now. And I'll say git add dot, my bad, git commit -m, and we'll say updated readme.md. If you made the same mistake as I did, and you probably didn't. Git push. Okay, and that pushes that up, and now I have an extra commit. Some people have also done like 1 commit, on their assignment 1. Don't understand that. We've been talking about doing things for a while, and with multiple commits, you work with your GitHub repository and you continue to add commits as you add features. Okay, that's what the idea is behind using Git and GitHub. All right, great. So now that we have, for this started going, what we like to do is, again, what I'd like to tell you guys to do, which is let's do a Control-Shift-B if you are using TypeScript, which is what I am doing, Control-Shift-B, and then I launch the watch task on TypeScript, and then it just basically compiles everything as an example. And then once I've got that, I've got those 2 tasks going, let's make a brand new PowerShell, and let's do a node mod. And you're going to notice that we cannot connect locally to a MongoDB project, because even though we're doing it here in our server config app.ts, notice that there is an area here at the bottom that is trying to connect, right? It's not going to give us a connection error because I'm not actually doing anything with the connection, but, and look, there you go. So this is what it's trying to do. It's going, hey, I've got a connection error now, and it crapped out. Why? There is no MongoDB connection. I have to initialize a command structure. So locally, I've got to go to do a command prompt and start off mongod, which starts off the server, like I showed you before. Once the server's connected, right, and if I go back to here, and if I restart my server locally, you'll see it's connected to localhost, okay? So that's how it looks. And I only have one item in my list. What I've done for you guys is I've also, just to give you an example of what the clothing store looks like, I've added in a clothing store JSON file, and it tells me what our name, brand, category, color, size, and price is going to be right here. Okay, so that is where we were leaving off last week. Let's look also at NodeMon locally, and if I do localhost 3000, then I should see my structure. So this is the structure we were left with last week. Okay. Again, you should have expanded upon this. Some people didn't add in a logo. Again, these are places where you would have lost marks if you didn't follow the instructions. And some people, for whatever reason, left all my icons. Remember, these are just examples. You should try and customize your portfolio so it looks like your portfolio, not a template, okay, like mine. So that is the structure that we're starting off with. But we need to add additional pages and so on to support we want to be able to show our stuff here, and we need some work. We have work to do in order for us to get there. Okay, so first things first, again, what we want to try and do here is think about how we're going to connect. So up until today, we don't have the right models for this. Okay, so what we want to do is we want to create a model to connect to our database. Okay, remember that if I go to command and if I go to Mongo now, then you should see if I do a show DBS, you're going to see the clothing store that we've been working with last week. And if I go use clothing store, then I can switch to the clothing store database, and then I can show collections, and it's going to show us clothing as the collection. I can say db.clothing.find.pretty, and we're going to see that this is the one that we have. This is our first document and the only document in a structure. And I've also noticed that since this is the document, we want to be able to load or create a model that connects to this database and reads this type of document. Right now we only have one, but we want to be able to at least read this one and show it somewhere. So this is what we're going to be doing today. So first things first, we need a model. Okay, so that's the first thing we're going to need. So let's go back to, just going to minimize this. Let's go back to Visual Studio Code and go into the models folder. And we can see that in the models folder, we just have a git keep file right now. And we want to add a new model for this, which is the clothing store model. So there's another way, a bunch of ways to do this. And again, since you guys are the first team that I'm working with today, one way we could do it is call it an item, right? This is a clothing item. And each clothing item has a name, a brand, a category, a color, a size, and a price, right? We can also call this an order item or something. I mean, it doesn't really matter how we do it, but we need to have some kind of, name for the model, all right? This could be a piece of clothing, the clothing model, whatever. You could call it item. I'm going to call it clothing because that's what we're really getting here. So the clothing model, that's how you would read it. So let's do that. So let's make a brand new file. We'll call it clothing.ts, right? Remember, clothing is a class, that's what we want to make, that connects to our MongoDB, so that way we can connect to it and somehow have, kind of read in the information from our database into our application. So first things first, we're in the models folder and we're making a clothing model. And the way first we want to start off with is I'm going to import Mongoose from Mongoose. And this is, again, using TypeScript. Okay. I'm going to make a schema. We're going to make this a const, right? And schema is really going to be a mongoose.schema. This is kind of like an alias, right, for the mongoose schema. That's what it is. So instead of me saying mongoose.schema every time, I can just use, I can just use just schema with a capital S. So that's the idea there with that one. Next, I want to start off with a const. We'll call this the clothing schema. There's our clothing schema, and I'll say that is a new schema, right? So I'm making a new object of type schema. And again, we'll just open it up. And inside the schema, notice it tells us that we need some kind of definition for the schema itself, which is in curly braces. So that's the first thing we need. So the schema is going to have, it's going to match what we've done here in our clothing store.json. So let's do a split screen. And what I want to do here is pull in our clothing store.json. So the way I did split screen is I pressed this little button over here where I want to split the editor, right? For those people who missed that. And so now we have an idea of what we need: name, brand, category, color, size, and price. All right, it's kind of a complex schema, but not much. Let's start off with name. So the name of the schema is going to be, and again, notice how I just crossed that out for a second. It's going to be a string. So that's the type. This is actually not TypeScript. This is Mongoose. Mongoose actually requires types for the schema. Next, we need a brand. Brand is also a string, right? Category. Okay, now this is something that could be an array of strings right now. So it could be a string array. And I'm going to go back, but for now, let's make it a string. I'll talk about that in a second. And then we are going to talk about color, which is going to be a string, as well as size, which is going to be a string. These are all strings, as you can tell, right? These are all parts of the item. And followed by price, right? Which, if you think about what it is, can I put in a number? Is that possible? Yes, that is a thing. I could put a number in there. And if I do, it'll be interpreted as a number as well. So $34.99 could be a number. So that's kind of what it could look like, a schema. One thing else we want to put in our schema is we also want to include the connection type. So for example, if I go here, I'm going to underneath inside the brackets, but outside the curly braces, I'm going to put a comma, and actually put it here. And then I can put another set of curly braces in here that's going to show the collection type, and the collection name is going to be called clothing. All right, so that is the collection, the clothing collection, right? And then what we want is, once we have this schema, so this is the way we're going to read stuff, okay? The clothing schema. What I want to do next is I want to create a model for the schema. So let's just hide this for a second. I want to make a new model. It's going to be a const model. We're going to call it the Mongoose model, right? Which is going to be called clothing, right? The clothing model, right? And we're going to use the clothing schema, this one. All right, so that is a Mongoose model that we're going to be using, okay? And model should be lowercase m, because that's just the way it's going to be. All right, so that is the way it looks. You can see that Mongoose has a model method, and the method takes in a couple things. It takes in the name of the model, as well as the schema, which we just defined right here, okay? Finally, we want to export this schema so we can use it, and we'll make it a default, and we'll call this model. So the default export will be the model that we just created. All right, so that right there is your Mongoose model that we're going to use when it comes to reading information. We want to read stuff. How do I do that? I'm going to do that by reading the kind of the information from my database. That's what I'm going to be doing, right? And I'm going to be reading it in this way. Excellent. All right, notice that there is no ID. I didn't have an ID for the model. We don't need that. I've also had these all lowercase. There are several ways to do this. Sometimes you want to make these all caps. It really depends on your structure, and I've done it in both ways in the past. For example, this would be a name, this would be a brand, category, and color, and size, and price. I don't think this is a bad decision. I don't think this is a bad decision to make them caps, just like we would in C#. All right, so let's make that change, okay? Notice that when I go to my clothing.js, it transpiles to look almost identical, right? The only thing is that exports.default is equal to model. That's the only thing that's different. The rest is identical. So that's the first part. Let's put this up on GitHub because we've kind of said that, you know what, we've made our model. Let's put that up. So we'll say git add dot, git commit -m, and we'll say added clothing model, and then git push to GitHub, right? So that'll be your clothing model. Just to support what we're doing, if I go up here and refresh, you can see that this is week 5C. We have 3 commits, and I can track each of your commits as you continue to work. This is where what I'm doing with you, okay? I'm going to grab this here and copy it. I'm going to go back to week 5, and I'm going to go where it says week 5 starter, and I'm going to make a new link. I'm going to put this in. I'm going to say week 5 GitHub, week 5C GitHub link. Okay, so that way if you want to kind of compare my code with your code, you can go here. All right, and we're going to continue doing that throughout the entire time. I'm trying to give you examples of how we start and what we do to add stuff. And I'll be almost exactly identical with week 5B, but just in case there might be some minor things. And if you want to follow along with me live, here we are. All right, so awesome. There's no changes here because we're not doing anything yet. So that's the first part. So the first thing we do is we make a contact, or if we're going to do contacts, in this case, the analogy is the exact same thing. For your assignment 2, right, instead of using a model for a clothing schema, you make a contact schema for your stuff, right? So your contacts would go here. So what would that look like? Let's make another model. We don't have this, kind of data in the database right now, but let's suppose I was making a contact schema. How would it look? Let's do it together. So almost identical to this is, in fact, is how we would do it. So let's dream a little bit about our contact schema. I'm going to go to models. I'm going to go to new file. Let's add another model for our contact. This is directly helping you for your assignment 2. So what it would look like, you would import, again, Mongoose from Mongoose, right? Same idea here, right? You would do a const schema, again, just like before, is equal to a mongoose.schema. So again, the alias that we talked about before. I want to do a const contact schema this time, right? That's going to equal to a new schema, right? And what I want to do, just like we've done before, is do this. I also, just to be preemptive, I'm going to mention that what the collection should be. If I was going to do a contacts collection, it would be a contacts collection. Let's say I would have that. I don't have that right now in my database, but I could do that. And then in here, this is where I would start my stuff. I might use something like a full name or a first name, last name. It's really up to you, of type string. I could also have an email address for my contact, which is also a string, and as well as a contact number, which is also a string. So this is an example of how you could do a contact for something called contact schema, and this would be inside the contacts model. Notice there's 2 models here, a clothing model and a contacts model, okay? And again, just like before, we would just do a const model, and you can do this for everything, mongoose.model, where we add a model called contact instead of clothing, and then we'll use the contact schema to connect to it. And then we'll finally do an export default called model. Okay, so these things, these are examples of what I've got here to connect to either your clothing model or your contact model. Now that we have stuff in here, we can also get rid of the git keep file. We don't need that. It's only there for as a placeholder when we don't have something in there, and we like to kind of keep things light. Let's add that up to GitHub as well. So again, control backtick, and we're going to say git add dot git commit -m, and we'll say added contact model, right? And git push. There's an example of your contact model that I want you to think about using. Mohammed asks, by defining schema, do we fix the fields in our documents? Because usually in MongoDB, we can save 2 documents with different key value pairs. Do we fix the fields? It's kind of like that. It's not fixing the fields, it's the way you're choosing to create a structure. Remember that MongoDB could be schema-less if you want, but typically what we want to do with the schema is create a structure so it's easy for us to understand how to read the data in from the database. Otherwise, you could have a completely different, document for every, in the collection. You can have multiple documents that are of different types, but this just makes it easier, Mohammed. So that's why we do it. Hopefully that answers your question. But we would do a new schema for every type of collection, typically. All right, so that is your schema, and the schema has different, kind of connections. All right, so let's do the next one. So once we have our model, the next piece is we need some routes, right? So whether we have a index.ts in our index.ts routes, if I go there, you can see all we do right now in our routes is we just read in basic pages, right? That's what we're doing here. And we have to think about what this really does. When I go to my index router and I get there from my config, so here's my config, my app.ts, then the only way I get there, if you notice the route, is this part. So this is kind of my default route. If I put the slash in there, followed by a route like about, then it starts off with a slash. But I want to also have a sub category or sub area, as an example, that I can also get kind of a clothing store or a clothing list or something like that, like a list of clothing, right? So the way to do that would be make a new router altogether, a new router, and the new router would only be there to show and modify routes for the clothing or contact or whatever you're going to do. Okay, that's how it works. All right, so one thing also that we talked about last week is that our router right now, although we made the models, our router doesn't do anything yet. In our index.ts, okay, as an example, and I'm just going to kill the package.json up here and the readme.md just to keep it simple. But in our router, we have both the routing part as well as the logic for the controller. We never really did controllers yet. Let's make a new controller so that we can split the logic from the route. Okay, that's what we need to do here. So in order for us to support that, before we move on, to actually do the connection, then in my controllers, and let's think about what my index controller is going to be, I want to start thinking about making a brand new file in my controllers folder. Let's do that. So new file, and I'm going to make this new thing called index.ts. Again, notice that it is the index controller. If I had another controller for contact, it would be the contact controller. If I had another controller for my clothing, it would be the clothing controller. Think about the controller file as a class that is the logic behind the model and the view. All right, so we have it kind of bound together here in one place, and we don't want that. We want to split this off so that our router is much simpler. And I'm doing this ahead of time because we're going to make other routers, and I don't want to do it later It's kind of like I want to go through the pain now, and so we can avoid the pain in the future. So let's get rid of our git keep file. We don't need that anymore. And in my my controller, which is index, I want to start off by including Express. So I'm going to say import Express, because I want to be able to use some stuff from Express. And I also want to use, with Express, you can import Express, but I can also import parts of Express. For example, I want to use the request, response, and the next function that's part of Express. And I can list that in curly braces. So I can say, I want the request, I want the response, and I want the next function methods, and I want to get them from Express. Okay, so that's what this does. So request, response, and next function are all things now that this file understands. Okay, because I'm importing Express, but I'm specifically importing parts of Express to help us with code hinting. All right, so that's the first part. So next is I want to think about, how we're going to start displaying stuff. So we're going to do a side-by-side here. So again, I want to do a split screen. And on the left, I want to have the router. On the right, I want to have the controller. So on the left, I'm going to go to the router, which is my index router. And on the right, I have my controller, which I'm writing right now. So let's think about what this is. When I go to this piece right here, what I really want to do is I want to display my home page. I also want to display my home page here. So how will this look when I need to make a function to do that up here. So let's do that. So on the right, I want to make a new function. I'm going to call this, I want to use export. I'm going to say export function, and the new function name is going to be something like display homepage, right? And I want in there to get a request, which is the request object. That's why I needed the stuff up there. A response, which is the response object. And next, which is going to be the next function. Okay, so that is what I want to take in. And you're going to say, wait, why, Tom? Why are we doing that? Well, you'll see in a second, because I'm going to take this out of here, and it's going to reference this. That's what's going to happen. This is going to return void. And what we're going to do here is inside of the display home function, I want all of this in here. So literally, I'm going to take this out of here, and for my router, cut it, and put it in here. It's that simple, okay? This is my first iteration of my display home function, and we're going to add more functionality as we go, especially when we start doing things like displaying my name in the, on the title bar and so on. Now, how do I link this to this? Well, remember that what this is. This part right here is the part that I'm doing in my display home function. So how do I do that? Well, we have to go back into the routes, this route in here, and now I have to import the new file that I made over here in controllers. I need to import my index.ts from the controllers folder. So the way we do that then is I'm just going to go back into here, right? And I'm going to say I want to create let me just get rid of this for now. I'm going to hide this. I'm going to create an index controller instance. That's what I want to do, right? And the way to do that index controller instance is I'm going to do something that looks like this. I'm going to say import, and I'm going to start off with the first thing I want to import, okay? And I want you to think about how this can work, right? I want to import something, right, from, and it's going to be / controllers / right, and then index is what I want. So this is where I want to get it from. But I can't leave it open like this. I need to specify which one I want. Now watch how this links together. So it starts finding the method that I just made. So I want the display homepage function from this. I can specify which functions I want, and I'm going to kind of include all of them in a second. But one thing at a time. So this is the function, and then all I have to do here is once I have this first thing is I can replace this piece, right, with display home, like this. So let's read this together. And so you see how this all links together. And then I'll take questions, because I know you guys are going to have questions. So let's think this through a little bit, okay? Let's think about what I just did. The first thing I did was I made in the controller part, all right, here's my controller, right? I made a function called display homepage that took a request, response, and next object, okay? Just like we would have here, request, response, and next. So this is the function, because I'm passing in request and response and next here inside my router, right? And then what I can do is I have some kind of action that I'm taking after I get the request, response, and next object. For example, I'm using the response object to render my index template, and I'm passing in a title, which is home, and a page that is home, just like I did before, right? This, in effect, what's happening is I'm returning this information back. I'm actually taking action and returning this back out, right, from my controller into my router. Okay, so there's no return statement. When I render, that's just an action I'm going to take, right? So this is what happens here. So instead of me making this whole complicated thing where I do an inline function, it's like I'm doing a named function called display home, just like we would do, we did before with the event handler. I have an event, it's the default page event, and I'm responding with an event handler, which is my display home page. My display home page in this case is located on another document, which is over here. And this is just the function that I'm going to use to perform the handling of this event. So if this default and home are the same, then I can use the same event. So I can say that I'm going to also use display home page for that too. So that is done. Now I need to come up with some functions that do these things over here, and I'm going to do them all at once, and then go back and then cut paste from these ones. So let's say we have a display about page. So I'm just going to copy paste this inside of my the index router or index controller and paste. And instead of display home page, let's call this display about page. Okay. And instead of, it's still going to have a request, response, and next object, but I'm going to have all of this as an example in here. So all I'm doing is copy pasting. Okay. So there's no difference yet. I'm also going to have an export, and it's going to be the a new function called display projects page. You know where this is going. And again, we're going to have this request, response, and next function that returns void, right? And we're going to do the same thing here. Again, many ways to do the same thing. I'm just going to copy paste from our projects page on the left, right here, into this part over here. And you're going to say like, wait, I don't understand. Like, this is the question I get sometimes. I don't understand why, Tom, we even have to do this, because it was working over here. Why would we do something like this here? We're separating our concerns. I can have different logic that is separate from the route, and I can reuse this logic in other routes if I want to as well. If I only put it here, it would only be available in this router. And we're going to see that there might be an instance where we need to use something in multiple routers or multiple places. And we would do that by separating our concerns and make them little components that we can connect with later on. This is the services page. And we're just going to get our services over here. Right now, they're all identical, but it doesn't matter because they don't do much, right? And the last one is the contact page. Again, I'm just going to grab this whole thing. And so also what we're going to do is for the contacts page, display contact page, notice that there's different pages and we're doing different logic. I can separate the logic and have other things. I can have specifically different things for different pages, just like we have here, but now we have a separate file that makes it reading easier. So here's just our logic, and this is our routes. We're going to see the difference in a second when I finish this up. So again, I just want to grab the contact page here and populate that in there. Okay, so that's the contact page. And now that I have all this, I can start doing some tricks. Okay, I can start doing some tricks. I have this in my controllers page, and what I can do here is instead of doing all this, watch this now, I can say, I want an about page function. So I'm going to start typing display about page, and notice that this is a little purple link. If I click on it, it actually imports it up here automatically. That's amazing, right? So I actually get the import statement as well as the link for my page right here. Again, this is all with TypeScript. You wouldn't get this functionality with simple JavaScript. Okay, let's try this again. I'm going to do here, and I want the projects page. So I display. Now notice that there's these purple links. These are the ones we want, not these ones up here. These ones are just finding this stuff because we're working within Visual Studio Code. It's giving me some code hinting, but I want this one, projects page. When I do that, it adds the projects page reference up here and replaces this with projects. Same thing with services. So display services page. I want this purple link right here, this one. All right, and finally, I want display contact page, which is this one, not this one. Okay. Once I've done that, now we have the exact same functionality, but you can see how beautiful and how simple our router looks, right? It's much simpler than before when we had this combined. Okay, so now I've kind of separated concerns, and I've created my first controller. This is the index controller, and I'm going to put this up on GitHub. It really depends on the code hinting, Mohammed. So Mohammed's question is, why are there only one purple link for one and there's some for others? Well, because it depends on how I've entered this in. The other ones, multiple pages come up when I start typing display, because display finds multiple things to display, and I've already included some of them, and so they become white links as opposed to purple links. But the one we want, the purple links are only left over from the ones we didn't import, okay? But now that we've got this, let's put this up on GitHub. So again, I'm going to go control backtick, and I'm going to say git add dot, git commit -m, and we'll say added the index controller. Okay, git push, and we're going to have those in there. And we've also separated the concerns from the router to the controller. Okay, so that's great. That's fantastic functionality right there that we've got, right? So what that's doing now is it gives us this separation of concerns, which is what we wanted, okay? That's great. I want to do the same thing now, right? Knowing that this is the structure that I want, and you can see that now I have controllers, I have models, right? And I have routes, and they're all separate. I want to make a route so that when I put in on the link, so if I go up to the page up here, and I put in, instead of contact, by the way, we should test it to make sure these are all working. You can see that they are, right? These are using the new controllers now. If I go up here and start typing in something like clothing-list, I want to pull up something instead of this 404, okay? I want to pull up a list of clothing that's in my database. There's a couple of ways I can do this. I can include the clothing list inside of my index router, but that doesn't really make sense, because what if I wanted to do clothing list and then I had a subroute that does add, or a subroute that does edit, or a subroute that does something else, right? So if I do subrouting, or almost like I have links that are in a different section or different, almost like a different container. Think about clothing list as a separate area of my website, right? So clothing list would not be part of my index router. It would be part of its own router. Okay, that's interesting. How would I do that? Well, what I want to do here is I want to make a new router, okay? And we start with this first. So go into router, I want to make a new file, and I want to call this the clothing index.ts router, okay? And let's use the index router as a model for us. So we can kind of get this as a, we'll do a side-by-side again. Here's our side-by-side. And on the left, we'll have our index router, right? So we have an example. And on the right, we're going to have our new clothing router, all right, which is going to be something we want to add. Similar to what we've done in the past, okay, we've done this in the past. What we want is, in our routes, we want slightly different information than what we've had before. So let's start off with the first thing. So I still want to import Express. Okay, this is kind of an important thing. And notice here, I'm importing all of Express, not just a part of it like I've done in the router. I want to make a const router is equal to express.router. These are the same. And I want to also export my default router. This is the first step in my new router that I'm making. Okay? The next part is I want to start thinking about, I want to get a clothing list, okay, the clothing list page. And it's going to be with something like /clothing list. Okay, that's what I want. Okay? So that's what I'm looking at. That's what I want. This is the link that I want it to look like. And when I go there, I want to start off with the default page. What does that mean? That means similar to what I have here, I'm going to do a router.get / will mean clothing list. And there'll be a router.get edit, and that will mean something else. So example, let's make all these little remarks first so you understand what I'm talking about. So I want instead of a clothing list page, I want to display, right, the edit page, right? That's what I want. I want to display the edit page where I want to edit an item, right? And the ID is going to be something I want to edit. The item will have an ID, and I want to specifically edit that particular ID, right? And the way to do that would be, I would go to clothing list, right? And it would be something like edit and then ID. That's what it would look like at the end of the day, right? So because clothing list is always at the beginning, right? I can make clothing list itself the default route in this case, just like I did the default route here is this /, right? This is where people get confused. So if I was to include clothing list in my index router, then obviously it would be something like /clothing list here, right? That's not what I'm doing. I'm making clothing list its own area, right? And if I make it its own area, it needs to have its own router altogether. So what that means is I'm going to have a router.get where I do a /, okay? And this / has some kind of method that's associated with it, just like I've done before, which is something like, I don't have this yet, but display clothing list page. It's going to be red right now. See this display clothing list page is red. Why? There is no controller for this page yet, okay? There's no controller. I've made a controller for this page. I haven't made a controller for this page. Let's make one. So now in my controllers, I want to make a brand new file. I want to call this the clothing controller, right? And let's do a split screen again. So on the right, I'll have my new clothing controller, and on the left, I'll have my sample one from my index. So here's my index controller. So I'm going to go back up to controllers, click on this one, and you can see that my index looks like this. Here's my clothing controller on the right. And let's see if we can not do the same things with the way it's done. So first I want to import Express. I'm just going to copy paste from this one because it's going to be identical. I'm going to grab this piece. Okay, so that's the first thing. I want my my clothing controller to have the same functionality, okay? Hopefully you're getting this idea, right? And then what I want to do is my clothing controller, right? My clothing controller. Now this could be a clothing list controller, or this could be a contact list controller in the future. Like you're going to make But what I really want to do is I want to import, now this is new, I want to import the clothing model. All right, let's do that. So inside here, this is a new part. And this is what's different from the index controller. The index controller doesn't require a model because it doesn't need a database to connect to. Whereas my clothing controller is going to connect to a database. So I need a model class to use. So I'm going to say that import clothing, right? My clothing model. That's going to be, I'm going to go into /models/clothing. All right. So the clothing object here is actually a reference to the clothing model. Remember the clothing model where I had all that stuff? Name, brand, and so on. That's what I'm connecting to here. Okay. All right. Next, what I want to make is I want to use a new function that displays the clothing list page. Let's do that. And by the way, now I will, in this part here, let's do the split screen with the clothing router. So again, I'm going to go here and click clothing router and clothing router. And notice it says display clothing list page. Let's use that same name over here. So copy. And over here on the right, I want to do the same things we've seen before, right? Where I say something like export function clothing list page, but it needs to have something we've seen before, which is the request, response, and next object. So I'm going to say something like request, which is a request, right? A response, which is a response, and next, which is the next function, and it's going to return void. And I'm just going to kind of put this over here for a second. And my display clothing list page that I'm going to have here is going to do something. It's going to use the clothing object to find, notice we are using the same syntax as we would with MongoDB. And I'm going to use my function. You can also use the newer functional syntax where I want to do clothing. So clothing, lowercase clothing, is going to find the clothing list, if you will. That's what's going to display the clothing list, right? And what we want here, right, is, let's check first for an error. If there's an error, then I want to return a console.error. However, if there's not, then let's print out, that's what this is like clothing, the clothing document. Notice it says document. Let's print out the clothing document. And it's going to freeze our page for a bit, but that's okay. I want to do a console log, and I want to print out clothing for now. Okay, we don't have nothing to render. We don't have a special page to render the clothing list, right, as an example. But this way, we'll actually show this in the on the console. And once I've done this, and I go here, what I need to do now, all right, and by the way, there's a quick way of doing this. I want to do the exact same thing because right now, our display clothing list doesn't know what to do. What do I need to do? I need to connect my router to my clothing controller. So just like before, right, when we did it, and remember that we have all this already, so I can hide this. And let's do the clothing, let's do the regular controller over here to get an example, or the regular router over here to get an idea of what it looks like. Okay, so how would this look like? Well, if I go to, on the right, here's what our regular router looks like. Notice that there's an import statement. So what I'm missing is I need to create a clothing controller instance, which I don't have yet, right? Which means I need to import, right, something from, and I want to go to the controllers folder, and inside controllers, I want to go to clothing. Once I've done that, then I can put in display clothing list page. So I can start with that one, display clothing list page, which cleans up my error that's in there. So this is all prep. That's what I've done. I've done all the prep so that way when let's bring up my clothing. So this is my router. And let's look at my completed controller right now. For now, it looks like this. This is my router. And now you can see the logic, right? This is my controller logic, right? My logic for my display clothing list page. It uses the find method of Mongoose or MongoDB to look through and return all the clothing that it finds inside of my clothing collection. That's what it does. How do I get that? Because of this. This clothing thing itself. Let's do another split as an example. And we can see that we're using the clothing model over here to do that. So this is our clothing model. So I kind of see if I can show everything for you, right? The clothing model, here's the clothing model. That is used here, right? I'm linking the clothing model to the controller, right? The controller is using the clothing model, we're exporting it, and I'm using the find method of Mongoose to find the clothing in the clothing collection, right? That's where it's going to look. And then it's going to return that information right here. So this is actually this is going to print out all the clothing or the clothing list to the console. That's what it's going to do right now because we don't have a page to do that for us yet. Okay. And this is the router. When I go to the default route for the clothing list route, I want to put in something like clothing list. The default route for clothing list is going to pull up the clothing list, display clothing list function, which is going to use the clothing schema to display everything inside the clothing collection. Whew. I know it might sound confusing, but these are the steps we need to take for everything, whether we're making clothing lists or a contact list. One last step. Now that we have these functions or these pages, our clothing list router, our clothing list controller, our clothing model, right? These are all classes, if you will, that we need to connect to our app.ts, right? So let's go back now. We'll just close some of these off. Okay, we'll close some of these up. And we'll go back to our app.ts inside of our server, app.ts. And just like we connected our index router, we want to make something new that is the clothing router. So up here where we say import something router from something, we use index router as an example from routes index. We're going to do the same thing for the clothing router. So we're going to say import. We'll say clothing router from ... routes / clothing. And this gives us all the stuff that's in the clothing router file is going to be injected right here. We'll have access to it. Then further down, when we actually do our routing, this one is where actually routing happens. Here is where we import the router in our file. We don't have to do it here actually. We can do it later, but this is typically the way we do it. So this is actually where routing happens. Routing happens now, right? And the way we do it is we use the route. We do app.use. And now, in order for us to get to our clothing list, we're going to put in the route that we want to see for the user. So when the user puts in clothing-list, they're going to be taken to the clothing router. This is our last step. So again, two parts to the app.ts file. One, we import a link. This is the link to our clothing router. And two, we use our new router with the route configuration or the words that we want to use for that particular area. Clothing list now is a new area of our website. So defines a new area of our website, right? Called clothing list. And everything starts from there. So the top level area for clothing list That's the default route. So that when we put in clothing list, what actually happens is it goes to the clothing route. The clothing route looks at the default route, which is going to display the clothing list page, which takes us to our controller. In our clothing controller, the clothing list page controller, it uses the clothing model to find all the clothing in the clothing collection and then display it to the console right now. Let's see if this works and how it works. So going back out to this, and notice how we have our clothing list and we had a 404. If I refresh now, right, we're going to get this spinning. Why? Because we don't have anything to display as an EJS page here. However, if I was to look at the console here, right? So let's look at the console. You can clearly see that we've read the database and we've got a ID from the database and the name, brand, category, color, size, and price that we've read from the database. My friends, this is the first part of one part of CRUD, which is the read part. This is the R for CRUD. Questions before we put this up on GitHub? Again, you're going to see a spin forever here. Why? Because there is no page to display. We're just simply displaying the data in the console, which is just temporary. Any questions for the people that are here or online on YouTube? This is where people don't understand what's happened. They don't get it. They're like, wait, what? How is the contact list or the clothing list or the computer list or whatever is going to be, how does that show when I put in, why is there are there two default routes? How come in the router we have a default route that's here and another one that's over here? Aren't they the same thing? No, they're not the same thing. Why? Because in the config file in app.ts, we start the index route with a slash, right? Whereas we start the clothing list route with a slash clothing list. So this is like in front of everything else that's inside of the clothing router, right? So in other words, if I put clothing list, it means this in the clothing route. It's the default route. Okay, it's almost like we assume that there's a clothing list here. Okay, that's what we're doing. Well, it's not showing anything, Mohammed, because we haven't passed in a page. We haven't rendered anything, have we? It's going to continue to spin forever because we're not rendering a page yet. We don't have a page to render. Let's make that page to render for our client, right? We need a new page now. Okay, that's the next step. If we want to display something, then what we need is a new view, which we do not have until this point, right? We need a new view that is going to be in our, that's going to show our clothing list, okay? So a couple things we need to do. When we display our clothing list, right, somehow it's got to go to that particular view. It's got to go to that particular view. So let's make the view that it's going to come up with first. So again, I'm going to go to views and I'm going to go to under content, right? We have our about view, our contact view, and a home view, and a project view, and a services view. And we need a contact list if we're going to do a contact list view, or we need a clothing list view if we want to do a clothing list view. Let's do the clothing list view first. So again, I'm going to make a brand new file, and I'm going to call this the clothing list.ejs. That is what's going to go there, right? We're still not quite done. You'll see where we're going to get into more details in a second. All right, so cool. But what I want is I want to go like this. I want to put a new H1 tag. And by the way, this is detecting as EJS. Let's change this so it detects it as an HTML file for now to give us some for Emmet, right? I want to use Emmet here. So I want to do an H1 tag that's going to say clothing list, right, for now. And this is similar to what we've done in the videos. I want a div tag with a class of row. And inside of that, I want a div tag with a class of column. Notice that I've done this in shorthand. This is shorthand. I'm using Emmet div with the class, dot means a class of row, and greater than sign inside of the div tag, I want a div tag with a class of column. If I click on this or press tab, it does exactly what I just said. Then, what I want for now is I want a table. So some kind of table goes here. This is just HTML5 comments. So let's see if I can get a table from Bootstrap. So again, going back up to here, let's go to getbootstrap.com. And I want to see if I can have a table example that I want to put in there. Now, it could be, this is changed, by the way, under content, there's tables. So notice there's tables here, and it gives you some examples of what tables look like. And I want to grab this basic structure, and I want to modify it for us. So grab this whole thing. And I want to go back to here, and inside my table, I want to paste it. Okay, now obviously I don't need all of this, and I need something different here. So this is the table header, and the table header is going to basically show the header for all of my fields, right? That's what's going to go here. So now let's add the header. I'm just going to split screen again, and on the right, I'm going to put an example of all the fields so we don't forget them. So I need a name, and I need a brand, and I need a category, and I want a color. Let's copy paste. We're missing a couple of headers. We need a color, right? And I want a size. Maybe there's going to be different sizes. And I also want a price. So these are all of my items in the clothing store right now. Brand, category, color, size, and price, right? Just like it matches our document. I'm just using this as a guide. Okay, I don't need really this in here. I'm just using it so we can not forget stuff. I have this, right? And what I want to do is I don't want to specify, this is the actual body piece. The body is going to be dynamically generated for me, right? What I want is I want only one of these. So let's get rid of the other two. And let's think about an example of what this is going to look like if we were to read it in. I want to make an area here that's a repeating row, right? So I want to make a repeating a repeatable row. And the repeatable row is going to be done by basically for every, it's going to almost be like a for each loop. For every row, or for every document in the clothing collection, it's going to generate a brand new row. That's what TR means, a table row, okay? So for every document, so this is going to be almost like our repeatable row template. Okay, that's what's going to go in here. So let's think about what this is going to look like, right? I want to make a for loop, and I can use EJS for this, right? So I want to make a for loop. So it's going to look like this. So I can say for, and I can say let count equals to 0, where count is less than my clothing collection length. Clothing, we don't have clothing yet, but we're going to pass in an item called clothing length. Clothing collection. We don't need this anymore. I'm just going to cancel this out here. For when count is less than the length of my clothing collection, right? Then if there's more left, then count plus plus. Let's make a little for loop. And we're going to open a curly brace, but not close it. We're going to actually open it here and use a closing bracket for EJS. And we're going to put the closing, curly brace down here by itself. So what this is kind of saying is we're going to start a code block up here, and we're going to terminate the code block down here. This is our control structure, which is a for loop. And every time we go through the for loop, I'm going to generate a brand new table row, and I'm going to increase this count every single time. So what I want in here is I want to show the counter, right? Instead of putting a number, I want it to dynamically increase the counter, right? So I'm going to say, let's use count +1, and I want to inject that in here with EJS. So I'm going to say, hey, EJS, I want to inject count +1 in here. So instead of putting a fixed number, I'm going to take the counter that I just made up here, and I'm going to inject the value of that in here. Remember, percent less than percent equals means take the value of a variable and inject it into my HTML. Cool. And then what I want to do is I want to use the clothing array. That's what this is supposed to be, a clothing array. And I want to print out my name of my clothing array. So I'm going to say clothing count, and I want to say dot, and it's going to be like my name, right? Because that is the name, and we can use to help us here. Let's split screen, and let's use the model on this side. So again, I'm going to split screen just to help us out. I'm going to go here on the top, and I'm going to go to models. I'm going to go to clothing, and you're going to see that these are the things that I got to put in here, right? Just like I've done in here. So this is what's going to happen. I can also look up here because it's the exact same thing I'm going to do down here. Okay. So this is what I want. So it's going to be clothing.name. I'm going to take this table and copy paste, and it's going to be clothing.brand and clothing.category and clothing.color and clothing.size and clothing.price. Okay, so those are the things we're going to generate for us every single time. And that is how we're going to print out all of our rows in our database. We only have one right now. We're going to add another one later. But this is how we're going to do the read function. We're going to read from the database, and it's going to print out this stuff. In order for me to do this, though, to go to the clothing list itself and all that kind of stuff, I have to send my router here. Okay, I have to, in my controller has to render this page. It has to render this page, which means if I go back up to here, and if I go back to my clothing route hits my display clothing list controller. My display clothing list controller is here. And right now, I'm not rendering anything. I'm just printing things out to the console, which is useless. I want to instead do a render inside of my controller that allows me to render using my new found page. So how do I do that? So instead of this, I want to render the clothing list page content partial, or clothing list content partial page, what I should say. Okay, and that partial page is inside of the views content folder clothing list, right? So that what I would do is I would say render, right? And I want to go use my index controller. And in my index controller, what I want to do is I want to pass in my title, which is clothing list. I want to pass in my page, right, which is clothing-list. That's exactly what I've done here, clothing-list in other pages. I want to pass in my clothing document in here. All my clothing document collection, I want to pass in here. So I'm going to pass in clothing. And I'm just going to call it the same name, clothing. So notice how this lit up. So clothing, it's called the same thing. We could have actually called this the clothing collection. I want to pass in the whole clothing collection in here. So let's rename this just so that you can see this. We'll call this the clothing collection, just to make it clear, right? And so clothing collection is now clothing collection is going to be passed into the clothing object, which is something that I use, right? I use this clothing object inside of the clothing list page. This is the clothing object that I was talking about before, right? Here's the clothing object. The clothing object, right, has a length because it's an array-like object, right? And the clothing object gets passed into the page, right? Because I've injected it with my controller. My controller injects an object like we've done in the past, and I can inject different properties. One of the properties is going to be this clothing array, and the clothing array is actually just the clothing collection, whatever that is. View is always part of the server, because Sinead, remember that the view is being rendered dynamically by the server, right? So now that I've done this, and if I save, and if I go back to look at this, and if I go to localhost, and if I refresh, you can see now I get this. Now I get this, right? And notice I get the clothing list, and it's big and ugly. Why is it big and ugly? Well, because we didn't do anything. And I'm also getting this. I'm getting clothing count. I'm actually printing out these things. So there's something I'm missing here. One thing is I'm getting a for loop, and I'm getting this stuff in here instead of an actual object, right? Clothing count, brand, category, blah, blah, whatever. So what am I missing here? Let's go back to what I did wrong. And I did it on purpose, but I wanted to show it so you could see it. Well, yeah, I'd done this, but this is actually just text, right? What this needs to be here instead is exactly what Mohammed said in the comments here on live. I need to kind of inject it, and I haven't done that here, right? And the way we would inject it is just like we've done in the past, exactly what Mohammed said. We have to use this percent less than, percent equals, and then percent greater than. So we're going to do this. That's the part that's missing. So we're going to go here and go exactly what Mohammed said to do. So equals, right? And then we're going to do percent. And we're going to do that for all of these. I'm just going to copy paste. There's other ways to do this, by the way. And I'll do that over here. Close it off. So that now I've injected inside of, let's grab this whole thing. I've injected inside each of the rows data as opposed to just text. If I just did what I did earlier, then I wouldn't inject anything. I would just inject a text. If I go back now to this, and if I refresh, you can see now that I'm getting something wrong. Something's going on wrong. Something's wrong here. So I'm getting like the number 1, but no data. Okay, what's the next problem? What's the next problem? I'm getting name, brand, category, color, size, price. I was able to get that data before. What am I getting down here? Am I getting an error, right? So here's what I got before. Notice it says name, brand, category, color, size, and price. But I'm looking for name, brand, category, color, size, and price caps. My friends, that's all it takes to give me nothing. What I have here has to match what I have in the database. What I could do is I could make a new database document that matches this, or I could match my model with the database. For now, we're going to match our model with the database because we have a database that has lowercase. We're going to do the same thing here. So here, brand, category, color, size, and price. That doesn't fix it. I need to also go into the model. I'm just showing you the problems, okay? I need to go to the model and change all those things if I want to match what's in the database, because that's how I put in the database. That's how these have to match. So name, brand, category, color, size, and price. And if I did that to the model, and I did the same thing with the view, then when I go back to the list, and if I refresh, you should see everything that I talked about before. But this is pretty big, and it wouldn't be bad if I put this whole clothing list inside some other kind of container, right? And in fact, if I go to Home, About, Projects, Services, and Contact, these are pretty cool. But what happened to if I go to this clothing list thing? I don't get all that. How come? How come? How come? Well, let's take a look and see why I don't have any separation. Because if I go to the About page, I have this class container every single time, and I have the same thing for my contact list and my projects and everything else. Wouldn't it be grand if my template automatically put a container around everything? Well, sometimes you don't want to do that, but let's suppose that I do. Well, here in the template, if everything has a container, just like I've done here, class container, then I can just simply take these two div tags and go to my, and I don't always recommend this, guys, because it really depends on how much flexibility you want. It can go in here, and then what I can do is I can replace the page in here with something that already has a container class. And then I can go through my services page and just wipe out this stuff that I don't need, because everything has a container. And so it makes that each of these pages is just a little bit less complicated, right? Again, because I'm duplicating, we don't want to duplicate anything over and over again, and we can reduce by doing it this way. And what the effect is what it's going to have is for the regular pages, they're going to all look the same as an example, but for my clothing list page, what it's going to do is it's going to center it just like every other page, which is probably something that we want because it's a little bit better. And since we're using it everywhere anyway, then that's pretty cool. If I go back out to this now and refresh, you can see now that this is kind of a centered list that is a little bit better looking than what it did before. We only have one list though, and it'd be really nice if we had maybe another piece of clothing. Let's see if we can add another object into the list for the clothing list in a database. So again, going up here, let's go to that Old Navy site like we did before. And I want to go to men. I'm getting another item just to look at, and bear with me, guys. Let's use some, instead of tops, let's go with pants just to give us some variation. And under pants, I'm going to just choose maybe a skinny pant. Sure. Skinny. And under skinny, let's pick a pant like a, something like this. I don't know, maybe a blue pant. There we go. By the way, I don't know if this was something that I would normally do, but now you can notice that there are a couple of additional items that might mess us up. One, we have this piece. Okay, so remember what we're trying to do is kind of come up with the same structure as we've done for every item, right? And if we've got an existing customer that gives us some pants, or some kind of item, we want to make sure that all their properties match. Let's go to our structure and let's see how we can fit in pants in here instead of a top. So again, I want to go use our clothing store JSON file, and I want to add another object. And notice that normally for JSON, what you would have is another object that has all of this, right? So I'm just going to copy this in here. And instead of the name being slim fit non-stretch cotton shirt for men, let's make it so it's skinny built-in flex ultimate tech chino pants for men. All right. Again, if you're a lady out there and you don't want to use the men one, you want to use something else, perfectly fine. Just an example for us, right? Old Navy is the thing. It's not tops now, it's pants, right? That is the category that we're using, right? So pants. And our color, there's different colors, blackjack, doe deer, in the navy, and panther. I'm just going to choose in the navy for now because we don't want to include everything, because that would be an array of colors, and I don't want to do an array yet. So again, under color, I would use some other color like in the navy. And this seems to be one of their standard colors. Size is an issue. Now, size is like length, and there's different lengths. There's tall, and there's also regular, right? So size, it actually, instead of medium, would be a length. We don't have length here, but we can use size as a property for now. In reality, what we probably want to have is a different collection specifically for pants, right? We're going to put everything in one collection though, and just use the same size parameter and just call it something else. So let's suppose you are 31W, then that is the size that you're going to put in here, 31W, 31 inches W, right? So that's the size, 31W. If you were tall, you would have some other sizes there. Is there? Well, I'm not that tall, so 31 probably is going to be for me, and that's what I probably want. Length also, so that is regular. Oh, that's the weight. Sorry, 31 waist. Haha. No. Yeah, that would not be my waist size. It'd more like be like 38 for now, because I'm a COVID weight kind of person. So that is something that's different. I've got like a waist size, and then I've got a length, like example 30 length, right? So those are the two sizes. So we need to code this somehow, right? And the way to do this would probably be something like a 38 waist for now. And again, we might have another thing altogether, and then maybe a dash and a 30 length, right? That's a very specific size, right? And then the price. And wow, the pants are more expensive than our top, so it's $47. So let's put that in. Yay. So I'm doing it here in the JSON file so I can reuse this later. One thing to note is that JSON doesn't like these two objects. It needs some kind of other object out here. And usually what we want to do is put a curly brace on the outside. We make a JSON file. And then a curly brace on the inside. These would be an array of objects. And you would call this array something like clothing, which should be an array, right, of objects, right? That's what it'd be, an array of objects, right? And that would be the clothing array, okay? So clothing, right, would be the array of objects. That's kind of what it would look like if it was a JSON file. Make sense? So we're just sorting this out so you can see what this looks like. We have two objects in the clothing array now. We have this one, and we have this one. The analogy for our MongoDB database is we have two documents in our collection, our clothing collection. Our array is like a collection, and our documents are right here. So I want to take this information, and I want to inject it into our database. And the way to do that would be, I'm going to go into my command prompt, and I'm going to do that clear screen. I'm going to say that db.clothing.insert, and then I'm going to take this part right here, copy it, go back here and paste it, close off the document, and press enter. And then the right result is 1. And then when I do that, if I do a db.clothing.find.pretty, right, we can see that we have those two objects, right? And this was given another object ID based on today's entry, right? But now let's see how this looks inside of our database. Does it read the second object? Well, if I go back out here and I go to here to the clothing list, and if I refresh, now we should see both. But notice that it also truncated our amount. $47 was the amount there. And that's what the amount was, because that's the amount that it was in our database from here, right? Notice it was exactly $47, and it removed the 00 because we didn't format it in any way. Don't worry about that. That is another thing for another day. But one thing we know is that now we can see the clothing list is showing the price. And the second one came up. So that's how you would read multiple items. We're going to start. It looks like we're not going to get to do all of CRUD because I went into so much detail for you guys, but I'm doing this because I want you guys to really understand. I've got lots of questions when we got to the CRUD piece in the past, and it was always like, I don't get it. I don't understand how things are read from the database, and that's why I'm trying to get in there and talk to you about. So let's do the first part is read, and we've read from the database with this stuff. We'll go a little faster now and see if we can finish the rest of CRUD. I doubt it. All right, so the next part is back to here. I'm going to go into the command prompt, and I'm going to say that git add dot git commit -m, and we'll say we added the clothing list route. And that's all we did just now. The clothing list, that's what the clothing list route does. It just shows you a list of clothing. And then git push. And that did all that stuff. That updated the clothing list JSON object, that did all those things that I just did. And it's all up on GitHub for you right now. Next, let's try and see if we can do an add. I want to add an element into the database. Well, add and edit are very similar, right? Add and edit are very similar. And so what we can do is we need in our clothing router, we need some other controllers, not just display clothing list, but also do an edit, also do an add, and also do a delete. Those are the three things, the pieces that are missing. Let's try and get the controller done today. I don't know if we'll be able to get everything done. I'll see if I can get it done another day, but for now, let's start off with this. So clothing.ts, we've got this display clothing list page. How would it look if we're gonna get the other pieces of the CRUD done here as well? So we know we need a display edit page, right? So again, I'm going to do another in our controller. I'm working in the controller now. I'm making a new function called, before we even do the route, called display edit page. And the display edit page, you're going to get a request. Hate that happens. A request, response, and next object. And inside this object, this function, let's make sure it looks nice, because I like to have the separation here, just like I've done everywhere else, and even here, right? This is the display edit function. How does the display edit function work? Well, let's suppose we have an ID, because remember we get an ID. We're going to say that the request.params.id is this object. So what is params? The request object has a bunch of parameters, right? And what we need is some kind of object that we want to edit. So ID is the object that's inside of our database, like we saw earlier. If I go back to control backtick, and you can see that in our up here that we have an ID. This underscore ID is what we want to look at. Every object has an ID, and I want to edit a specific object, and that's how this one works, right? So first we get the ID from the parameters ID, the ID we're going to pass in. And then what we want to do is we want to pass the ID to the database, right? And that's the one we want to edit, right? So I want to say something like a DB, it's like me doing a db.clothing.find, and when I do a find, I want to find a specific object. Usually when I do a find, I use the find where I do a filter like ID, right? And then the ID is the ID that I'm looking for, which is this ID, the ID, okay? So that's kind of what it looks like if I was going to do this on the command line, right? So if I knew the ID that I was looking for, I could find that item, and then I would return an object of that ID. Whenever I do a find, the first part is the filter that I'm looking for, right? The first piece is the filter. All right, that's the first piece I want to find. Before in find, which what we've done over here is I've just done a general find where I find everything. But if I wanted to find a specific object, let's say I just wanted to find the first one. So I could just say a db.clothing.find, and then I can use a filter where I can say, I want to find an ID that matches that ID. So 60B7, E3DF, 6C99C584B, 8B, 2C11F. Okay, I'm just showing you this. So this is the one I want to find. Show me an object that matches this. And if I press enter, if I did it right, and I may have not, 6B, 7E3DF, 6, C99, C584, B8B, 2C11F. I'm looking to find a piece of clothing like this. That's the inside of the clothing array. I'm looking to find an object with an ID of this. That's what I'm looking to find, right? And it's not an ID, but actually an object ID. That's what I missed. So ID that has to have this piece too. Let's try that again. What it's looking for is actually everything, which is object ID of this, right? And then you get the response, right? So that's what it needs. It needs everything. That's what I'm looking. So I'm filtering by the ID property, right? So that's what I'm doing here. I'm actually filtering. So I get the ID from the list, right? And I'm going to edit that one. So let's do that equivalent thing. So I'm going to say, hey, clothing. Hey, the clothing thing, which is the clothing collection. I want to find by ID. And I want to find by ID that ID that I'm looking for. I want to pass in a couple of things that I don't need because it needs a couple things. Projection I don't need, and I don't need where it says options. So I can just pass an empty objects there. And then I need an object that has an error and a clothing item to edit. I'm going to call it that, right? And I want to use the new syntax to do that kind of stuff that looks like this. So this is the clothing item I'm going to edit. Okay? One step at a time. Then what I want to do, right? What I want to do is I want to go in here and I'm going to say if there's an error, right? We're going to a console error. If I can't find that object. And then I want to res end the error. I want to kind of end with the error, cancel out. Otherwise, if there's no error, show the edit view. I need a view for this. I don't have a view yet, right? But if I did, it would look like this, res.render, and I want to render the index view with my title, right, being something like edit, and my page, which is the edit page, and my clothing item, the item that I want, right? Which is going to be basically my clothing item to edit. And that's the one I want to pass in, right? By the way, I could have called this the item, whatever I want to call it. I could call this, instead of clothing, I can call it like something like item, right? So item is the clothing item to edit. And that's what I pass into the review. We don't have this edit view right now. Right? We don't have this edit view, so we have to create it, right? We already have, and by the way, we don't even have a route for this yet. There's no route even, right, for the display edit page. So let's make the view anyway. So again, if I was going to go to the view, I'm going to go to the content view and the content area, and inside the content area, let's make a brand new view, right, that allows us to do the, kind of the editing. So what I want is an edit view. Let's add a brand new item. So new file. I'm going to call this edit.ejs. And in the edit.ejs, I want a form, more or less, that I want. I want a form that I can edit, right? And it's going to be basically a form that's going to show the name of the title, some kind of message area, as well as a form method, and so on, right? That's what I want. So let's do that together. So it's going to be a div class, a div let's make it so that's not EJS, it's HTML. There's HTML, right? And I'm going to say a div with a class of row and a class of justify. As an example, content, large, center. This is just a bootstrap class, right? And I want to have a gutter of 3 units, all right? So that's the first thing. Inside there, I want to have an h1 tag, right? As an example, that's passing in the title, right? So let's add in the title of the object, right? And I want to say clothing, right? So edit clothing, that's what it's going to be in this case. And then I want a form. Now, I could hand bomb a form by myself, and I could start with something like form. I can get the, with the form itself, I can have a class of column-large-6 and a column-medium-10 and a column-small-10. This is just CSS classes, from the from Bootstrap. And what I want in here, instead of an action, I want a method which is going to be of type post. So instead of me doing a GET request, there's 2 types of requests. When I submit, I'm going to do, when I display the form, it's going to be a GET request. But when I submit the form, for editing, it's going to be a post request. Okay, those are the 2 things. And I kind of talk about this in my video online a little bit. But let's do the first one, the first form. So the first part is I want to display, kind of one item. And let's see if we can get some information from Bootstrap like this instead of me hand bombing it the entire way. So going back to Bootstrap, and I want to go to forms, and I want to go to overview, and it's going to show me some form entry, right? And I could use an input group or something like that, or I can make it so that it looks like this. It's really up to you how you do it. So you can see that here's a field set example, and so on. So you can get the form that you're going to edit that's in here. Okay, that's what we're doing here. But and so here is an example of a form text with the type of password. And when you start typing the password, it gives you this obfuscated text with these little dots, right? That's kind of a way of doing it. And that's what we can do. We can do a select, and there's something called an input group. Let's look at input group. An input group kind of looks like this, and I think it's a better way of doing forms. It gives us a bit of some examples. So let's take the first one. I only want one at a time because I'm going to kind of make them on my own. This says username, but we're going to change it to our purposes. So again, I'm in forms input group to get this thing, and it's going to look something that looks like this. So copy, go back to my form and paste it. But I don't need all of this. So the span is going to be a class. Input group text is good. My ID has to be reasonable. So it's going to be something like the name. So, kind of like name is the ID. We could also call this clothing name or whatever you want to call it. And then that would be where instead of the @ sign, we're going to have, kind of the name for the clothing. All right. So that is the first part. And then the input, so that's the span, almost like this is going to be my little label. And then the input type is text, of course. And I need an ID, right? Because notice that there isn't an ID here. Let's add it in. So I'm going to say the ID is going to be equal to name. It's got to match what I have in my form. The type is text. The class is form control. The placeholder is something that's going to appear there. This is going to be the name, right, of my object. Let's take away the, area label is just going to be something like if I have difficulty viewing the form, I can use accessibility objects like the area label to help me. So in here, what I can just say is name, and then the area described by is what I want to describe this, which is the item name. And then what I want to continue where I want to say that the name is actually really important as an element. That is the name of my variable. And value, right? Value is very important. And the value is actually something that I want to inject. So I want to say that inside of this, right, I want to put the item dot name, right? And I also want to say that this item is required. Okay, so this is the first element inside of my form because I'm using the name element, and again, it would be nice to have all the items in the form in order for me to use it, and this is something that I'm doing. I can make my form one item at a time. So let's do that. So name, remember the next one is brand. So just like we've done before, we copy and paste, this will be brand, right? And the ID will be brand. The name will be brand. This will be item.brand. And this will be brand for the placeholder and brand for the name and item brand, okay, for the ARIA describe by. And then after that, I can't remember all of them, so let's bring up a split screen and let's look at our model is always the best way to look at it because it gives us the clothing items we want. We have brand there. Let's grab the other ones in here as well while we quickly make the form up. Okay? And we're going to time out here, guys. I'm so sorry. Because we're not going to have enough time to do everything I want to. So name, brand, category. Right? Category will be category here, lowercase. And category will be here. And item category will be there. And this would be the category. And your brand, this is all ARIA stuff, so inclusiveness, right? So we can have people who have visual problems that we could see all this stuff. So category, we're halfway done. Color, you get what I'm doing, right? So this would be the color, right? And let's just do a bunch of those first while we're doing it. So color, and item color. And then you can see that this would be color, lowercase now, as well as this would be color here, and this would be color. So this would be color, and then let's keep going. So instead of category brand, category color, this would be the next one, which is size. So again, notice that it's capitals here when I display it, but lowercase when I actually access it. So because that makes sense, right? So size, item size, and also this would be size lowercase. Okay, finally, instead of size, we have a price. So price, right? And inside of our price, then what we would have is all the price parts here. So price, and price. And guys, we're going to time out here, but you get what I'm doing, I hope. What I'm doing is I'm putting together a form that when it gets displayed, right? When it gets displayed, it actually displays the item, right? Now, right now, we have this part, and the last thing we need is, kind of an edit button is what we need. And I'm just going to quickly grab a button example. So it'd be something that looks like this. We might have a button with a class of button, and then button dash primary, and then and that's the button itself. We need the button to also have an ID. Let's give it an ID. And you can do ID with a hashtag, ID of edit button. As an example, you can see that gives me the ID there, right? And what I can do in the button itself is I can put in an I tag, right, with a class of FAS. This is for Font Awesome, and then FA-edit, and then FA-large, so a large edit button, right? And then what I can do is before the button's over, it can just be called edit. So that would be the edit button. Okay, so that's the edit button. And I can have a submit button, and I can have other things too, like some kind. This would be the type. The type is very important here. For this button here, the type would be a submit type. Type is equal to submit. When I click the button, it actually does the post request, like we talked about before. And then I could have another button that's a cancel button, right? And the cancel button itself could be a cancel type. I'm not going to do that here because the form would be too long, and I'm going to time out, and I want to talk about other things before we go. So one thing I need now is, now that I have this part, I have an edit page. This is my edit page, right? Then going back to my controller, right? So I have my page, and if I go back to my clothing controller, right? Then my display edit page, I res render, index, edit. Here's my edit page. So this is my controller, but now I need a route. So I got to go back to my route in my clothing and then add in the route that's in there, right? Because I can't even get to the edit page without a route to get there. So, so remember what that would look like. It's exactly like this. We would do there's two routes actually, a router.get and a router.post. Router.get and a router.post. Let's do the router.get first. So if I'm displaying something, I'm going to do a router, let's do the router.get first. I'm going to do a /edit/ and then colon. Anything after the colon is the variable that I want to read in. That's my params that I talked about before. So ID, you can call this whatever you want, by the way. I can call it Tom, right? And then I could make that my params, res.params.tom would be the thing that I would do. And then I want to call the display edit page. So let's do that, display edit page. And notice that I can go to that thing we had before. Here's the display edit page. And if I press enter, it adds it in to the, the import for my controller. And that is my display. I'm not going to do the submit yet because that would need yet another controller. I'm just going to time out. I won't have time to do it. But I would have another function in here that would be, process edit page. I don't have the process function. I'm only going to display it. So what would the display function look like? Well, if I go back out to my page, and if I go to here, and if I did things right, I could say, clothing list /edit. And then if I had something like that, that would be great, right? Now it says it's not found. And why is it not found? Because even though I put edit, I still need a item, right? And you can see clearly that it's crashed my code. And the reason for it is because, well, I really don't have an ID like that, right? I don't have an ID like that. Let's take a look and see what happened. So if I go down here, it goes, okay, 404, cast to object ID failed for value of 1, right? The path ID for model clothing, there is no value for something like that. What it's really looking for is an object ID that has all that stuff. So what I need to do is, let's restart the server for a second because I crashed it because that's what I did. I can go in here and let's see if I can just grab an item ID like this, right? You see that's more of a better ID. Let's copy it. Let's do that here. And then if I go to here, I can go to edit, I copy. This is the actual object ID that I got here. And then I can go back to my page, right? Let's try that again with my page here. And then I'll see if I can paste in that object ID and see if I can actually get it. And what happens now? Does it still crash? What happens? But that's kind of how it would look like. If it was going to look, it would look like this. Clothing list, edit, and then the item ID would be there. And that's the item that I would try to show, right? Now let's see what happened. Why did it crash now? How come it didn't work? Okay, so again, let's see what happened here. So I did a 404, I did a 1, and then I restarted the server. Here's my MongoDB, and it says cast to object failed for value 1 at the path _ID from model clothing. So what the heck is it talking about? I never cast anything for 1. So we can do some troubleshooting, right? And this is the last part. So what is the ID that I'm getting? Let's see if we can get the ID. We're going to output this. So I'm going to do the ID out here. So we're going to say something like, hey, let's print it out. So I'll do a console.log ID. Let's see what that ID is incoming. And let's restart the server again. So again, restart the server. Yay, it restarted. We're back at localhost. And let's see if we can put in the ID there when I do an enter. Okay, now it kind of worked. That's weird. How did it work before, but not, before that, who knows why. But this is what it should have looked like. Should have looked like this. So that is the idea. It kind of interpreted the idea. And then what it did was it went to the server and filled out all this stuff and printed out this page. This is an example of the edit page that it would print out. Okay? Now, it might be cryptic. You might look at this and go like, that's weird. How did it work, Tom? Well, probably because when I refreshed, it was already in refresh mode because it was kind of trying to read the same item that I did before. But that's a danger. Look at that. It crashes if someone puts in an ID in there that is not found. So we could put in a try-catch loop or something like that. We haven't talked about any kind of error handling right now. We're just reading stuff, and we're assuming that the user is going to put in the right ID in here. And how would the user know this big ID? Well, they would look at the clothing list, and there would be an edit button on the right-hand side, and that edit button would pick up the ID that I'm trying to edit, okay? And that I show those kind of things in the video, okay? But the idea here is the same. And I've shown you the TypeScript pieces that you need to make this go. Okay, so that's it for us for today. So let's go into just a couple things that we have. So we've done part of create. We've done a part of the update. We haven't really finished the update yet, but I went into a lot of detail to explain to you how we start doing the read, as an example, properly, how we're going to start doing the update. Notice that we need views for every operation we need a view as an example. And that is something that we've been talking about. We didn't quite get through all of CRUD. It was kind of ambitious to try and get it all done. If I can, as an example, we'll go through it more in detail again. But remember, a lot of this is up on eCentennial for you. In the original stuff that we had, right? Because at the end of the day, right, we have it up here. So let's take a look at that so I can show you where that is. If you go, remember, in the video tutorial piece, you have all of this, and this part right here is exactly what I've talked about. I went mightily quick in here to show you how to do Express CRUD because I already had read from the previous video. Here we didn't, and I went through it and showed you how to do it in, kind of succinct way. Alex says, for assignment 2, do we need an edit page for the contact page? An edit page for the contact list, you mean? Yes, you do need you'll need one page. You can use, actually, if you look up here, I actually use a combined page where I can do both edit and add with one page, is what I kind of show you how to do. And you can switch between the two options if you look at the video, all right? But you do need to do some editing for your contact list. You have to do full CRUD. And if you look at the assignment details, let's look at the assignment details really quickly before we stop for the day. So if I look at the assignment details, let's go there. So assignment 2, for authentication, we need full CRUD, if I'm not wrong. Let's take a look here. So it says, login view, a business contact list view, and an update view. And the update view is basically both the edit and the add. All right, that's what it is. So that's something that I've asked you guys to do. And you can see that it says the business contact list view is kind of the read piece, right? And then it says that there will be an update button, which is kind of like the edit button, and a delete button in the list. So in the row, imagine that we're going to have a row here, right? And in this row, you'll have two buttons on the end. You'll have a edit button and a delete button. And the edit button and the delete button will do exactly what this is telling you to do. It will have an update view with the form I just made. So I made a view, a form that allows you to update any contact. I'm showing you a piece of clothing, but contact, I mean, I go through the video and show you how to do this. And then the delete button and a cancel button. I didn't quite get a delete button done or a cancel button, but I did do the submit button, the edit button, okay? So that's really full CRUD is what I'm looking for as an example for your contact list. Okay, any other questions before we end for the day? I kind of taken you through a tour of some pieces of the object. Again, I've timed out, but the great thing about this is that I'm showing you how to separate your controllers from your models, from your routes, from your views. So now we're supporting full MVC or model view controller, kind of a paradigm. Let's put this up on GitHub because this will be the last piece that we do. So we're going to do a git add dot git commit -m, and we'll say added first draft of edit page, because we didn't really quite finish it, right? Git push, and we didn't do the rest of the update. We just did kind of one part of the update, which is the display update piece. What's missing is you would have to do a process edit page, which would be a post type request. You'd have to do the other pieces, the display add page, which would modify the edit page. You can use it, if you're smart, you can use one page, like an update page, to do both editing and adding, right? We're editing searches through the database to find the ID that you want to edit, and adding just makes a new object that you're going to add into the into the page itself. Okay, so that's what it does. And then finally, deleting. There is no page for delete. And one thing we're also missing is the navigation changes, right? So inside of our navigation component, inside of our header, we'd have to have some kind of way of showing our contact list, in your case for assignment 2, or our, in our case, our clothing list for what the example I'm showing you here. All right, we've gone over by about 7 minutes. Any questions before we stop for the day? And then again, if you have questions or if you want to connect with me one-on-one on Discord, I'm always available for you guys. I can help you out with some of your issues with assignment 2. Thanks, Alex. Anyone else? Any questions? So that's it for today. Hopefully that guided you a little bit into what we're talking about for assignment 2. We're doing full CRUD. So create, read, update, delete operations with Mongo. Thank you very much, Alex. Anyone else have any other questions or comments or concerns? If not, then let's stop the video, and I'll see everybody next week. Again, remember next week that we're going to be doing an asynchronous class for Wednesday, as I have a bit of a conflict, and I'll send a note off for that this week. All right, I'll stop the YouTube stream, and hopefully I'll see everybody next week. And that's it for us, guys. Thank you so much. Good luck with